What if I told you that dark hair, dark eyes, and olive skin have been part of the Irish genetic landscape since before Rome rose, before the Celts invaded, before Christianity touched these shores? For generations, people have pointed at their black hair and wondered, where does this come from? Who put this here? We invented stories. We created myths. But in 2017, scientists finally solved the mystery using cutting-edge DNA analysis, ancient bones, and genetic mapping. And the answer takes us back not centuries, but millennia, to the very first people who walked on Irish soil after the Ice Age melted away. This is their story, and it changes everything about how we understand Irish ancestry. Every culture has its myths. Ireland is no exception. Among the Irish diaspora, particularly in America, one myth has persisted with remarkable tenacity for over 400 years. It is the story of the Black Irish. According to this narrative, during the catastrophic Spanish Armada of 1588, Spanish galleons were scattered by devastating Atlantic storms. Some of these ships found their way to the rocky coasts of Ireland. Spanish sailors, dark-haired and Mediterranean in appearance, washed ashore and survived. They were welcomed by Irish maidens. Over time, these encounters created an entirely new population, a mysterious group of Irish people with distinctive dark hair, brown eyes, and olive complexions. These were the Black Irish, or so the story went. The myth was romantic, exotic, and entirely captivating. It suggested that the Irish were not purely Celtic, but carried within them the blood of distant seafarers. In Irish American communities, the term became a marker of ethnic pride and cultural distinctiveness. Writers and intellectuals embraced it. Families passed the story down through generations. The Spanish Armada became the unofficial origin story of the Black Irish, and few people thought to question whether it was actually true. But history reveals inconvenient truths. When historians examined the Spanish Armada narrative carefully, the story unraveled. Records from 1588 tell a very different tale. Approximately 5,000 Spanish sailors were caught in the catastrophic storm. Those reaching Irish coasts, perhaps a few hundred, did not find welcoming arms of Irish women. Instead, they encountered English garrison troops who were ruthless. At Streedaw Bay in Sligo, nearly 1,100 Armada survivors perished. Those captured faced execution or imprisonment. The few who escaped were hunted down, sent back to Spain, or absorbed so completely that no trace of their surnames remained in Irish genealogical records. There were simply too few survivors, conditions too hostile, and cultural barriers too profound. The Spanish Armada could not account for an entirely new ethnic group within Ireland. Yet the myth persisted. Even as historians dismissed it, even as the evidence grew more damning, people continued to believe in the Spanish connection. This is the power of a good story. This is how mythology works. We believe what we want to believe, and we hold on to those beliefs even when the facts suggest otherwise. But in the early 21st century, something new emerged that would finally settle the question once and for all. That something was DNA. Modern genetic technology would do what historians could not. It would peer back through time itself, reading the actual biological code that connects us to our ancestors. And what it revealed would shake the foundations of everything people thought they knew about the Black Irish. In 2011, researchers from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and the Genealogical Society of Ireland conceived an ambitious project. They would create the first comprehensive genetic map of the Irish population. They would collect DNA samples from people whose ancestry was deeply rooted in specific regions of Ireland. To ensure accuracy, they established a rigorous criterion. Each participant would have 8 great-grandparents born within 50 kilometers of each other in Ireland. This requirement meant that the study participants represented genuine regional ancestry, untainted by modern migration patterns that might obscure deeper historical truths. Over the next 6 years, they assembled their cohort. 196 carefully selected individuals agreed to participate. They provided saliva samples. They contributed genealogical records. They became part of something larger than themselves, a scientific investigation that would rewrite Irish history. The data they generated was extraordinary. Researchers analyzed the DNA of these Irish participants using dense genome-wide SNP genotyping technology. This means they examined hundreds of thousands of genetic markers distributed across the entire human genome. They then compared this data with samples from thousands of other individuals across Britain and Europe. They studied ancient Irish genomes extracted from bones that had lain in the earth for thousands of years. What emerged from this analysis was a revelation. The study, published in December 2017 in the journal Scientific Reports under the title The Irish DNA Atlas, Revealing Fine-Scale Population Structure and History Within, Ireland, fundamentally changed our understanding of Irish genetics. It demonstrated that the Irish population could be divided into 10 distinct geographically stratified genetic clusters. 7 of these clusters were predominantly of Gaelic Irish ancestry. 3 were of shared Irish-British ancestry, each cluster mapped onto ancient Irish provinces or historical kingdoms. The geographic boundaries of genetic similarity followed the contours of Irish geography and history as if some invisible hand had drawn them. This was not random variation. This was the fingerprint of deep history written in the human genome. But here's where the study becomes truly remarkable. When researchers examined the DNA of these Irish participants and compared it to genetic samples across Europe, they found something unexpected. The closest genetic relatives of Irish people were not found in Spain. They were not found in the Mediterranean. Instead, the analysis revealed high levels of Northwest French ancestry and West Norwegian ancestry within Irish populations. The Irish genetic code carried within it the signatures of ancient migrations from the European continent and from Scandinavia. The Spanish connection, so central to the Black Irish myth, was conspicuously absent. This was not a subtle finding. This was not a matter of interpretation. The DNA clearly showed that whatever genetic contributions Spain might have made to Ireland, they were negligible and ancient, not recent and catastrophic. The implications of these findings reverberated through the academic community. If the Spanish Armada had not created the Black Irish, then what was the origin of the dark hair, the brown eyes, and the distinctive features that set some Irish people apart from their red-haired, fair-complexioned neighbors? The answer required scientists to look backward through time with even greater depth. They had to examine not centuries, but millennia. They had to study the ancient bones of people who had lived in Ireland thousands of years before the Celts arrived, thousands of years before any recorded history. Archaeological teams working in Ireland have recovered the skeletal remains of Neolithic farmers who first brought agriculture to the Irish island around 7,000 years ago. These people did not originate in Ireland. Genetic analysis of their remains reveals that they came from the Near East, from the lands we now call the Bible lands. These ancient farmers brought with them more than just agriculture. They brought cattle, they brought cereals, they brought pottery and ceramics, and crucially, they brought genetic predisposition toward dark hair and brown eyes. These were not rare recessive traits confined to a small group. They represented the normal genetic variation within early European populations. As these Neolithic farmers settled Ireland and intermarried with the indigenous hunter-gatherer population already present on the island, their genetic material was absorbed into the broader Irish population. Over thousands of years, this ancestry persisted, creating a genetic substrate that would eventually produce individuals with distinctly dark features. The story grew more complex as subsequent waves of migration reached Ireland. Around 4,000 years ago, during the Bronze Age, new populations arrived. Archaeological evidence suggests contacts with continental European populations, with Scandinavian peoples, and with others whose genetic signatures remain visible in modern Irish DNA. Each of these migrations added layers to the whole Irish genetic tapestry. Some populations left stronger genetic marks than others. Some were largely absorbed without significantly altering the existing genetic landscape. But across these millennia, a pattern emerged. Irish genetics became a palimpsest, a document upon which many hands had written their stories. The dark features, characteristic of the Black Irish, were not the result of a single dramatic event. They were not the product of shipwrecked Spanish sailors in 1588. They were the cumulative inheritance of thousands of years of human migration, settlement, and genetic mixing. The Irish DNA Atlas study revealed another fascinating aspect of Irish genetics that further demolished the Spanish Armada myth. The researchers detected clear evidence of Norse Viking gene flow into Ireland. This was not surprising. Irish history records numerous Viking raids, settlements, and cultural interactions. But the genetic evidence showed that these Norse contributions were distributed in specific geographic patterns. The genetic influence of Vikings was strongest in certain regions, particularly in areas that had experienced direct Viking settlement and colonization. This geographic specificity was a crucial finding. It demonstrated that significant genetic contributions to Irish populations showed clear geographic structure. If Spanish Armada survivors had truly created the Black Irish, one would expect to see Spanish genetic ancestry concentrated in the counties where ships wrecked, particularly in the west of Ireland. But no such pattern exists. The dark features of the Black Irish are distributed evenly across Ireland, suggesting an ancient, pre-Celtic origin rather than a recent, localized event. The 10 genetic clusters identified in the Irish DNA Atlas study painted a picture of Ireland that was far more diverse and complex than popular mythology suggested. Central Ireland, Connaught, Dublin, Leinster, South Munster, North Munster, and Ulster each possessed distinct genetic characteristics. The researchers identified a major genetic barrier to the north of Ireland and Ulster, suggesting populations that had experienced significant isolation or different settlement patterns. These clusters did not represent different ethnic groups or different races. They represented subtle variations in ancestry that accumulated over millennia due to geographic isolation, differential migration patterns, and local population history. Some clusters showed evidence of stronger connections to continental European ancestry. Others showed stronger signatures of ancient Irish hunter-gatherer populations. Together, they created a mosaic that reflected Ireland's complex past. The ancient genomes proved particularly illuminating. Scientists extracted DNA from skeletal remains buried in Irish soil for thousands of years. When researchers compared genetic profiles of ancient Irish individuals to modern populations, they found something remarkable. Despite invasions, migrations, and cultural transformations, the genetic contribution of these ancient populations remained profound. The ancestors of Stone Age farmers who arrived in Ireland 7,000 years ago left an indelible mark on the Irish gene pool. This ancestral DNA persisted through every wave of Celtic invasion, Viking raids, and English colonization, flowing through the veins of modern Irish people. This discovery suggested something profound about Irish identity. The Black Irish were not descended from Spanish sailors. They were direct genetic descendants of the earliest farmers who brought agriculture to Western Europe. Their dark hair and brown eyes connected them to people who had walked Irish soil when mammoths still roamed Central Europe, when Britain was still connected to continental Europe by a land bridge when the Irish Sea was not yet a sea, but dry land of what had been called Doggerland. This realization transformed the meaning of Black Irish identity. Instead of suggesting exotic foreign ancestry, it suggested deep Indigenous roots. It suggested a connection to Ireland that was older, more profound, and more essentially Irish than any foreign myth could convey. The research team also investigated whether any other theories about Black Irish origins might hold up to genetic scrutiny. One persistent myth suggested that the Black Irish might be descended from Romani gypsies or from African populations. The genetic evidence thoroughly debunked these theories. There was no significant African ancestry in Irish populations beyond what would be expected from very recent post-colonial admixture in isolated individuals. The connection to Romani gypsies was equally unsupported. Irish travelers, who had sometimes been confused with Romani populations, were shown to be a distinct ethnic minority with Irish roots dating back over 1,000 years. They had separated from the settled Irish population between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, suggesting an indigenous Irish origin rather than an external one. The Irish DNA Atlas study also revealed something unexpected about the medieval period. James Joyce, the famous Irish author, had once remarked that the people of County Galway possessed the true Spanish type. For centuries, some people interpreted this comment as evidence of Spanish genetic ancestry in Western Ireland. But the genetic data suggested a different explanation. The Spanish physical type that Joyce observed was likely the result of the same ancient Neolithic ancestry that affected other Irish populations. The coincidence of similar physical features between some Irish people and some Spanish people did not indicate a common recent ancestor. Rather, it suggested that both populations carried forward genetic inheritances from ancient European farmer populations that had once spread across the continent before the advent of Indo-European languages and Celtic migrations. What fascinated researchers most was the finding that these ancestral patterns had persisted with such clarity through the millennia. This suggested that Ireland's geographic isolation had created a relative stability in its population genetics. Unlike continental Europe, where massive population movements had repeatedly reshuffled genetic distributions, Ireland had experienced greater continuity. Waves of invasion and migration had certainly occurred, but they had not completely replaced the existing population. Instead, new arrivals had mixed with and been absorbed into populations that already carried deep ancestral roots. This pattern of continuity combined with selective admixture created a unique genetic landscape. It produced a population that was recognizably Celtic in culture and language, but genetically diverse in ways that reflected the deep human history of the island. The study did identify one period of significant genetic change in Irish history. The analysis revealed evidence of substantial admixture events that reflected the Ulster Plantations of the 16th and 17th centuries. During this period, English and Scottish settlers were deliberately planted in the province of Ulster as part of a colonial strategy. The genetic data showed evidence of this population movement. A distinct genetic cluster emerged in Ulster that reflected this mixed ancestry. This finding was noteworthy because it demonstrated that recent historical events could leave detectable genetic signatures. Yet, despite this significant admixture in Ulster, the Black Irish phenotype, the distinctive dark features, remained evenly distributed across all of Ireland. This geographic uniformity strongly suggested an ancient origin predating all historical records of invasion and settlement. The implications extended beyond academic genetics into the realm of Irish identity and cultural understanding. For centuries, The Irish had been depicted in various ways by outside powers. During the 19th century, pseudoscientific racism had attempted to categorize Irish people as racially distinct from Anglo-Saxons, often using crude physical descriptions that emphasized dark features as markers of inferiority. Later, Irish Americans had embraced the Black Irish myth partly as a way to assert ethnic pride and cultural distinctiveness in the face of American discrimination. The notion that Black Irish ancestry connected to Spain conveyed a sense of sophistication and old world culture that seemed to elevate Irish status in the hierarchies of American ethnic identity. But the genetic truth was far more meaningful than any of these constructed narratives. The Black Irish were not Spanish. They were not a recent admixture created by a dramatic historical event. They were Irish, deeply and fundamentally, in a way that extended back to the very dawn of European civilization. Their dark features were an echo of Neolithic farmers who had crossed the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast to bring agriculture to Western Europe. Their ancestry was intertwined with the Celtic people who had migrated from Central Europe to dominate the island. Their genetic code carried signatures of Norse Vikings who had raided and settled Irish lands. But all of these threads had been woven together through millennia into something uniquely Irish. The Black Irish were not exotic. They were indigenous, ancient, and profoundly connected to the soil of Ireland through thousands of years of continuous habitation and genetic continuity. The research also shed light on why the myth of Spanish ancestry had proven so persistent and appealing. The Armada story was dramatic. It was romantic. It suggested that significant historical events could shape populations in visible and meaningful ways. In an age when people had limited understanding of genetics and genealogy, such explanations seemed plausible. The story satisfied human curiosity about origins. It provided a neat historical explanation for observable physical variation. But it was ultimately a false explanation, a myth constructed to fill a gap in historical knowledge. Science had now filled that gap with something far more interesting. The true origins of the Black Irish were not localized in a single dramatic event, but distributed across thousands of years of human history. They represented not a foreign intrusion, but a deep indigenous inheritance. The 2017 Irish DNA Atlas study sparked renewed interest in Irish genetics and heritage. Follow-up research continued to expand the sample size and refine the understanding of Irish population structure. Collaborations between Irish researchers and international teams produced additional insights. The study demonstrated the power of combining historical, genealogical, and genetic data to produce a comprehensive understanding of population history. It showed that modern genetics could definitively answer questions that had puzzled historians and folklorists for centuries. And it revealed that the truth about Irish ancestry was not diminished by its scientific basis. If anything, the genuine ancient history of Irish people was far more fascinating than any myth. For individuals of Irish descent seeking to understand their heritage, the findings offered new perspectives. DNA testing became increasingly popular as the cost declined and accessibility increased. Thousands of people of Irish ancestry around the world began submitting their genetic material to commercial DNA databases. They were looking for connections to their past, for confirmation of family stories, for answers to questions their ancestors had carried with them across oceans and through generations. Many discovered, to their surprise, that their genetic ancestry was far more complex than they had imagined. Some found unexpected connections to continental Europe, to Scandinavia, or to other parts of the British Isles. Others learned that the stories their families had passed down, while not scientifically supported, pointed to real patterns of historical migration and settlement. The story of the Black Irish thus became a case study in how human societies create, maintain, and eventually revise myths about origins and identity. The Spanish Armada narrative had served important psychological and cultural functions. It had provided a framework for understanding physical variation. It had offered a connection to Oli, D-world sophistication and culture. It had allowed Irish Americans to assert ethnic pride in contexts where that pride was otherwise devalued. But eventually, scientific evidence forced a reckoning with historical reality. The myth could not survive contact with DNA evidence, yet what replaced it was arguably more profound and more meaningful. The genuine history of Irish genetic ancestry spanning thousands of years proved to be far richer and more complex than any single myth could capture. It spoke of small groups of intrepid farmers crossing vast distances to settle in a strange land. It spoke of indigenous hunter-gatherers already present in Ireland, their lives forever changed by the arrival of agriculture and new populations. It spoke of Celtic peoples migrating from continental Europe and eventually dominating the island. It spoke of Norse Vikings raiding, settling, and intermarrying. It spoke of Normans and English colonizers. It spoke of centuries of conflict, cultural interchange, and population mixing. Throughout all of this complexity, certain genetic patterns persisted. Certain ancestral signatures remained visible in the present-day population. The dark features of the Black Irish were not exotic markers of foreign ancestry, but rather the visible expression of deep Indigenous history. The Irish DNA Atlas Project represented a milestone in the history of human genetics and population science. It demonstrated that population genetic studies could be conducted at high resolution, revealing fine-scale structure within seemingly homogeneous populations. It showed that such studies could illuminate both recent historical events and ancient prehistoric migrations. It illustrated the power of combining genetic data with historical, archaeological, and genealogical information to produce comprehensive narratives about the human past. Most importantly, it revealed that the truth about human origins, while sometimes less immediately dramatic than the myths we construct, was ultimately far more interesting and meaningful. For the field of Irish history and cultural studies, the implications continued to unfold. Historians and archaeologists began to re-examine Irish prehistory with new attention to genetic evidence. They developed more nuanced understandings of how successive waves of migration had shaped Irish culture and society. They recognized that the apparent cultural unity of medieval Gaelic, Ireland had emerged from a genetically diverse foundation. They understood that the conflicts and cultural divisions that characterized Irish history were not simply a matter of foreign conquest, but involved complex interactions between populations with different ancestral origins, different languages, and different cultural traditions. The Normans who invaded Ireland in the 12th century were not simply introducing foreign blood into a pure Celtic population. They were adding yet another layer to a palimpsest that had been accumulating layers for thousands of years. The question of identity became more complex and more interesting in light of these findings. What did it mean to be Irish? Was it a matter of ancestral genetics? Was it a matter of cultural identity and language? Was it a matter of political allegiance and national citizenship? The DNA evidence suggested that none of these factors alone could adequately answer the question. Genetic ancestry did not determine cultural identity. People of overwhelmingly Celtic ancestry participated in English culture. People of mixed Irish and English ancestry identified profoundly as Irish. Genetic markers did not map perfectly onto language or culture or national identity. Instead, these various dimensions of identity had evolved in complex and sometimes contradictory ways through Irish history. The Black Irish myth had persisted for so long because it attempted to answer a basic human question. Where do we come from? Every individual, every family, every culture seeks to understand its origins. Myths provide stories that make sense of the past in ways that connect to human values and aspirations. The Spanish Armada narrative was appealing because it suggested that significant historical events could leave lasting genetic marks. It implied that Ireland and Spain were connected through romantic adventure and human encounter. It suggested that Irish people possessed a heritage that was not purely Celtic, but enriched by contacts with distant lands. But while these myths served important psychological functions, they were ultimately false explanations for observable phenomena. Modern genetic science has provided more accurate explanations, but these explanations are not less meaningful. In fact, they are more meaningful in many ways. They connect contemporary Irish people to thousands of years of human history. They show how distant migrations of prehistoric farmers left genetic legacies that persist to the present day. They demonstrate how cultural changes and population movements leave footprints in the human genome. They reveal that Irish identity is built upon foundations that are simultaneously ancient and diverse. The Black Irish carry within their genetic code the inheritance of Neolithic farmers from the Near East, of Celtic peoples from Central Europe, of Norse Vikings from Scandinavia, and of many other ancestral populations whose names and stories have been lost to history. This deeper understanding of Black Irish origins does not diminish their cultural significance or their importance to Irish identity. If anything, it enriches that significance. The dark features that set some Irish people apart from their red-haired neighbors are not marks of foreign conquest or exotic admixture. They are visible expressions of the deepest layers of Irish history, genetic echoes of the first farmers who transformed Ireland from a land of hunter-gatherers to a land of settled agriculture. Every time someone of Irish descent looks in a mirror and sees their dark eyes and black hair, they are looking at a genetic inheritance that reaches back 7,000 years to the dawn of European civilization. They are looking at a biological connection to ancestors whose names are unknown but whose genetic legacies are encoded in every cell of their body. The 2017 Irish DNA Atlas study stands as a monument to the power of modern science to illuminate human history. It definitively answered a question that had puzzled people for centuries. It showed that myths, no matter how appealing or how deeply believed, must ultimately yield to evidence. It demonstrated that the truth about human origins, while sometimes arriving through the austere, language of genetics and population statistics, is ultimately far more profound and meaningful than any myth could ever be. The Black Irish were never Spanish. They were always Irish, connected to their homeland through thousands of years of genetic continuity and cultural evolution. And that truth, grounded in science and supported by evidence, is a heritage worth celebrating and understanding. This is the real story of the Black Irish. This is the truth that DNA finally revealed.